All right. To survive in our information saturated culture, we put our minds on automatic pilot in order to protect ourselves from the flood of media messages that we constantly encounter. The danger of this processing, this automatic processing, subjects us to mass media that can condition us in our thought processes. This is a quote from James Potter, which is the author of our textbook. Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. T. I'm Mr. Molina as well. You can call me Mr. T or Mr. Molina. This lecture series is going to be based around our chapter 2 content, which is the media literacy approach. So, as we've seen and have heard already, a fair amount of definitions about media literacy. It is our opportunity to increase our abilities and our skill sets to exercise control over this vast array of messages that we encounter day to day. And through all the proliferation of several platforms beyond the television and the radio and the newspaper, which our previous generations have had the opportunity to have, we now have, of course, the digital era, which allows us to have multiple platforms at our disposal. So media literacy becomes even more important, and we look at the approach of what it actually entails. So today's lesson will be over three main points. We'll cover the three basic building blocks of media literacy, the skills that are necessary to practice media literacy, and the advantages and disadvantages of having that higher degree of media literacy is something that we will end with. So media literacy is a multi-dimensional concept. It's very uh, diverse in its thinking. If you really think about what media literacy entails, it is regarded as having four dimensions, and these are listed here. There's a cognitive dimension, which is more or less the study of how we process information, how we draw our attention to the facts, the raw data, the names and definitions, and even symbols, and how we interpret those throughout our media consumption processes. So it also looks at the interpretation. How are we receiving that? And how are we comprehending that or even questioning it? So it's the cognitive dimension, even the emotional dimension, like the meme down here, always makes me laugh for some reason. But it's also the uh, perceived feelings that people might get, how we read our own feelings triggered by the media we are exposed to. Aesthetic dimension focuses on the art form, the layout, the coloring, the way a scene is shot, or the what the characters are wearing. Moral dimension has to do with our concentration on what really resides in our soul, in our hearts, when we are engaged in a song that might go counter to our moral principles, as an example. So it's our baseline judgment calls in what we deem as right or wrong, or what we might continue to consume based on our moral codes. So James Potter addresses those dimensions very well in chapter 2. But moving on into the three building blocks, there are known skill sets that are displayed in this chapter, and knowledge structures and the personal locus. So these are the three building blocks that we will primarily cover today. And let's look at the 7 skills that are listed in chapter 2 and emphasize a few of them. Now, media literacy has an opportunity to really engage us in a different way, as stimulates us to adapt to the changing communication technologies that have become rampant beyond just the internet, but we're thinking about, TikTok and the algorithm and the super, uh, you know, way of keeping our attention through this sort of brain hacking, as a term to use, that you have heard of before. It opens our minds to new media messages, both positive and negative. So These skill sets are extremely important to begin to exercise as we continue the course. So, analysis is essentially the breaking down of a message into meaningful elements. So, this is the opportunity to where we start critically evaluating the content. So, evaluation is kind of what seeps in here when we do the analysis. It's making judgment calls on whether the data that we're receiving on our Twitter feed by a person who might be deemed as maybe not trustworthy. We're making judgment calls all the time, and it can become exhausting. But that's another skill set, is the vetting process, the evaluation aspect of all of the ecosystem of information that we have to determine whether it's true, false, or if it's misleading. Now, the grouping aspect is important, and it's essential to ask one simple question here, which is, what is the intended purpose of a message? And when we ask that question, we determine what elements are like, which are different from other groups of elements, especially when we look at a message that is intended to persuade us, like an advertisement. That is something that we can then begin to exhaust and say, here are some of those sell tactics. Here are some of those characteristics of this kind of message when I start to group those images and those messages together as persuasive messages versus others that might be deemed as more to inform us. And so those may have other characteristics like fact-based information that might be the lead of that story. So there's all kinds of different groups as well. So it's important to establish what is the intended meaning there. What is the intended purpose? That's called grouping. Induction is also extremely important as well. And we'll be moving on to the last three skills of the seven, which are deduction, which is using a general principle to explain particulars like data. Typically, when we use syllogistic reasoning, when we think about what COVID has done to our community, when we deduce the numbers of the day, how many people were infected, well, how do we deduce that in terms of our risk level, right? How do we begin to synthesize that information, which is the next one? So they all kind of play together here. And synthesis is really taking the opportunity to then interpret that data, assemble your elements, think about, maybe putting it into a new sort of thinking structure, like, can I go out anymore? Should I go to restaurants without wearing a mask? Is that more risky, depending on how I deduce that data, right? So this is the internal, you know, making sure that we process that information, that we've evaluated it, we've analyzed it, but now it's coming to a place where we really need to be thinking about our own personal behavior, and should we alter that based on the information through the media that we're getting. So the synthesis part is a really key point here. It's a great skill to have. It allows us to reformulate some of those messages and maybe update our existing perspective and perception of how dangerous it might be to go out in this particular time of COVID-19. The abstracting part, right? Capturing the big picture of the media message in a few words as possible. That's really important to think of, especially if you're thinking about going into journalism, especially when you're thinking about creating a headline, or even if you're an Instagram content creator. How do you come up with those captions in such a few amount of words there? So that's another skill set. So these skills will hopefully enable us to really approach these types of images and words that the media presents to us in a very holistic fashion, as you can see there. Knowledge structures is another building block of media literacy, and it's really a set of organized bits of information into a memory bank that allows us to start to begin to build our understanding of the media. So just the information alone, the tidbits of information, do us some good in having that information kind of spread out. But when we begin to build a knowledge structure, it's using all of those hearsay bits of information that we validated to begin to formulate our new perspective. So knowledge structures allow us to see those patterns, to understand and begin to ask questions. The facts by themselves are not enough, right? It's knowledge that we build upon. So it says here, facts themselves are not knowledge any more than a pile of lumber is to a house. So when we begin to see mass media conglomerate maps like you see below, or the house that's an analogy there, the media conglomeration and knowing who owns the content is a knowledge structure. So just facts about Disney or CBS or who owns Viacom is not enough. But when we put those pieces of information together, we start to build our knowledge base. And knowledge structures have 5 areas that are argued by James Potter in to address these areas. So how does media affect us as an individual? What are the consequences of X amount of content per day? Or if I were to follow this rabbit trail of conspiracy, what's going to be the consequence there? Media content itself and the analysis part of that. The media industries, who owns what and what is their, what might be their advantage of you interpreting something a certain way. In addition to that, the real world translation. What does this mean for me? How does consuming my media and my media diet and what I'm consuming, how does that help me to be a better person or to advance myself economically or even socially? The self as well, in considering how this all plays out in regards to me identifying with who I am as a person and using media to really understand yourself and perhaps what might be your own individual impacts or even maybe your own output towards the media itself. So it's understanding yourself more with the usage of media content itself. So the last building block is a personal locus, which is discussed. And I like to think of this as my own ball court, right? What's within your locus of control? The awareness of our personal goals do direct the process of information seeking. So if we think about approaching media with goals in mind, maybe I want to be a better person, maybe I'm going on a diet, or I want to save money. Those might be some of the approaches that the author is addressing that might help us to get over that hurdle to begin to have a different kind of media experience that will allow us to gain more control. The amount of energy we distribute or we disperse when processing information is all part of our personal locus. It's part of our control. So if I'm doom scrolling at midnight, not necessarily going to have as much control as if I had a fresh breakfast and a fresh mind when I'm, thinking about seeking out that information. The strength of your personal locus, the more conscious we are of our mental codes. So again, if we have a pretty good exercise routine, we know when we need to maybe jump off the app, or we give ourselves a certain time frame. Even if we're not going in with set goals, we at least have a goal of not spending too much time on a particular activity related to media consumption. So setting limits, setting boundaries, but at the same time understanding that if I'm going into this device and I'm going to consume media, it is going to be more of an active process, a more active exercise to maybe seek out ways to achieve my personal goals and have those as my baseline for consuming that content on that particular moment. So the goals is what drives your personal locus, which then leads to building more skill sets and being more mindful of those that we just mentioned. And then creating those knowledge structures that embed ourselves into a much more, say, productive media consumption pattern throughout our lives. So the advantages are immense in developing our higher degree of media literacy. It gives us a better appetite for wider variety of media messages, which can translate to a wider range of perspectives. Second one is more self-programming of mental codes, internal processes that allow us to have a better evaluation mechanism, have a better vetting system of what is true and not true. And then, of course, more control over the media and our media diets and our media habits. So I hope this was helpful. We did get a chance to cover the three building blocks of media literacy, which are the skills, the knowledge structures, and the personal locus aspect to media literacy. And I will end with this quote by Linda Ellerby, who's a known journalist. And her quote says, "Media literacy is not just important, it's absolutely critical. It's going to make the difference between whether kids and even adults or young adults are a tool of the mass media or whether the mass media is a tool for kids to use." So thank you for joining me, and I appreciate your feedback as we move forward in the course.